After months of war, thousands of casualties, a global energy crisis, and fears that the Middle East was heading toward its biggest conflict in decades, something extraordinary just happened. The United States and Iran, two countries that many believed were on a collision course toward a much larger regional war, have reportedly agreed to a framework that could end the conflict, reopen the world's most important oil choke point, and completely reshape the global economy. And the markets reacted instantly. Oil prices crashed. Stock markets surged. Investors celebrated. But before the world starts declaring peace, there are still major questions. Is this deal actually real? Who won? Who lost? And could this agreement become one of the most important geopolitical turning points of 2026? Today, we're breaking down exactly what happened, why it matters, and what comes next. For more than 3 months, the conflict involving Iran, the United States, and regional actors pushed the Middle East to the edge. The biggest concern wasn't only the fighting itself. It was the Strait of Hormuz. If you've never heard of it before, this narrow waterway is one of the most strategically important locations on Earth. Roughly 1/5 of the world's oil and gas supplies pass through this tiny maritime corridor. When shipping was disrupted, energy prices surged worldwide. Governments worried. Businesses worried. And consumers felt the impact through rising fuel and transportation costs. The possibility of a prolonged closure created fears of a global economic shock. That's why what happened this week is so significant. According to officials from both sides, Washington and Tehran have now agreed on a framework designed to halt the war, reopen the Strait of Hormuz, and begin negotiations on larger issues including sanctions and Iran's nuclear program. Reuters reports that the agreement includes reopening maritime traffic and ending the U.S. blockade of Iranian ports, while broader negotiations continue. But the story gets even more interesting. Just a few weeks ago, this outcome looked almost impossible. Military operations continued. Missile strikes were still occurring. Both sides accused each other of violating ceasefire understandings. And despite repeated diplomatic efforts, trust between Washington and Tehran remained almost non-existent. For years, the relationship between the two countries has been defined by sanctions, military tensions, proxy conflicts, and disputes over Iran's nuclear ambitions. Then came the war. As the fighting intensified, the economic consequences began spreading far beyond the Middle East. Energy markets became increasingly unstable. Shipping routes were disrupted. Insurance costs skyrocketed. And governments across Europe and Asia became increasingly concerned about the possibility of a broader regional escalation. Behind the scenes, however, diplomats kept talking. Negotiations reportedly involved multiple intermediaries and regional actors. Over time, discussions shifted away from immediate military objectives and toward a more practical question. How can both sides stop the economic damage before it becomes catastrophic? That question appears to have created an opening. And eventually, it led to the breakthrough we're seeing now. Now let's talk about the details. Based on reports from multiple outlets, the emerging agreement appears to include several major components. First, Iran would reopen the Strait of Hormuz to commercial shipping. This is arguably the most important element because it directly affects global energy supplies. Second, the United States would halt its naval blockade of Iranian ports. Third, discussions would begin regarding sanctions relief and access to frozen Iranian assets. And fourth, negotiations over Iran's nuclear activities would continue separately as part of a longer diplomatic process. In other words, this isn't necessarily a final peace treaty. It's more like a framework designed to stop the immediate crisis and create conditions for broader negotiations. That's an important distinction. Because while headlines are celebrating peace, many of the toughest issues remain unresolved. Questions surrounding uranium enrichment, long-term sanctions, regional security arrangements, and the future role of Iran's allies across the Middle East. Those challenges haven't disappeared. They've simply been moved to the next stage of negotiations. The fastest reaction came from the energy markets. Within hours of the agreement being announced, oil prices dropped sharply. Why? Because markets trade expectations. And suddenly, traders began pricing in a future where one of the world's most important energy routes could return to normal operations. For months, the risk premium on oil had been enormous. Investors feared further disruptions, supply shortages, and potentially even a wider regional war. Now that risk appears lower. As a result, oil prices immediately moved downward. And this matters far beyond energy companies. Lower oil prices can influence inflation, transportation costs, manufacturing expenses, airline profits, and even the policies of central banks around the world. In many ways, the Strait of Hormuz isn't just a Middle Eastern issue. It's a global economic issue. And that's exactly why financial markets reacted so dramatically. Reuters reported oil prices tumbling as investors anticipated renewed energy flows through the waterway, while global markets rallied on expectations of reduced geopolitical risk. This is where the story becomes politically complicated. Supporters of the agreement are already claiming victory. The Trump administration argues that the framework advances key objectives, including opening the Strait of Hormuz and creating a pathway for future negotiations over Iran's nuclear program. Iranian officials, meanwhile, are presenting the outcome differently. Many in Tehran argue that Iran resisted military pressure and secured discussions involving sanctions relief and access to frozen assets. In other words, both sides are telling their domestic audiences that they achieved their goals. And that's actually common in diplomacy. Successful agreements often allow each side to claim some form of victory. The real test won't be the headlines. The real test will be implementation. Can both governments sell this agreement politically at home? Can they maintain the ceasefire? Can they move from a temporary framework to a lasting settlement? That's where previous peace efforts have often failed. And that's why some Iranian officials continue urging caution despite the optimism surrounding the announcement. The implications extend far beyond Washington and Tehran. Countries across Europe have welcomed signs of de-escalation. Asian economies that depend heavily on Middle Eastern energy supplies are watching closely. Financial markets are recalculating risk. And global leaders are hoping this marks the beginning of a more stable period in the region. But there are still serious risks. Hardliners on both sides could oppose concessions. Regional actors may have competing interests. And unresolved issues surrounding Iran's nuclear program remain highly sensitive. History shows that peace agreements can collapse if expectations rise too quickly. That's why analysts are warning against premature celebrations. This may be a breakthrough. But it's only the beginning of a much longer diplomatic process. Even supporters of the deal acknowledge that the difficult negotiations are still ahead. So where does this leave us? After months of war, economic disruption, and fears of regional escalation, the United States and Iran appear closer to peace than at any point since the conflict began. The Strait of Hormuz could reopen. Oil markets are already responding. And diplomats have created a pathway toward broader negotiations. But the most important word right now is not peace. It's implementation. Because agreements on paper are one thing. Making them work in reality is something entirely different. Over the coming weeks, the world will be watching for signs that both sides follow through on their commitments. If they do, this could become one of the most significant diplomatic breakthroughs of the decade. If they don't, the crisis could return just as quickly as it appeared to fade. And that makes the next chapter of this story every bit as important as the one we've just witnessed. If you enjoyed this deep geopolitical breakdown, subscribe for more coverage of global power shifts, international conflicts, and the stories shaping our world. Because in geopolitics, today's ceasefire can become tomorrow's crisis. And we'll be here to explain every step of it.